I'm sitting here thinking about a lot of things. This is a kind of a trip down memory lane for me. I'm flattered that Bob has asked me to come. I'm very appreciative of what he is doing and what you all are doing in the real estate world. I'm sitting here looking at the Real Estate Entrepreneurship that says two things that are vital to me: real estate, which has been a big part of my life, and entrepreneurship, which is critical to any progress we've made. I'm sitting here in the boardroom at George Mason when I remember the first boardroom was in a little building over on the other side of the campus, and we had 4 little buildings, and George Mason was a few thousand students in the woods. I'm thinking about all those things, and I'm thinking about when I came to Fairfax out of the service in 1956, actually, when I started here in November of 1956. I'd lived in Virginia all my life, but almost 60 years ago I came to Fairfax, and I thought it might be helpful and interesting to you to have a look at what the county was in 1956. It was really split up between a few new developments with single-family homes. Pimmitt Hills had just been really gotten underway. Eddie Carr was building in Springfield. A few other single-family developments were happening. The Beltway was under consideration. They were talking about someday we're going to have something called the Beltway. I worked for a few years with a law firm that when I went with the firm in '56, they said, "You might like to work in Fairfax County." I'd actually started in Arlington, which is my home, some 83 years ago. And the partner said, "You might want to go to Fairfax because I think there's a future in Fairfax." Now, I'm painting all these pictures because I think it's important when you understand entrepreneurship in Northern Virginia. You need to understand where it started, and I've been privileged to have that 60-year view of what happened, to grow up with it, to enjoy it, and to frankly profit by it, which I'm proud to say I did. I have no problem with profits, particularly in real estate or any other thing, because that's what makes our country work. So we started the Beltway, started acquiring land in '57 and '58. Very few people knew what the Beltway would be. It was a road around the district, and everybody thought it was a pretty good idea. Along about the same time that we started on the road, they founded something over in Bailey's Crossroads called George Mason University, in an 8-room old schoolhouse. And George Mason University just had a sign out and had a few students, and I mean a few, maybe 500 or 600. Along about '58, they had an uproar over the Burke Center Airport. They were going to put 4,000 acres at Burke Center at Burke, Virginia, into an airport to provide an emergency airport for National Airport. I got to stop and give you a footnote. The first time I ever saw a plane take off was about 1938. My father took me down to what was then Hoover Airport. The fellow ran out with a flag across Route 1 and held it up, and that's when the plane took off across Route 1. And that was sort of back in the beginning. Well, for 15 years they debated what they were going to do to supplement and provide an emergency landing strip for what became Hoover Airport. As I understand it, President Roosevelt had watched them talk about where they were going to build a new airport, so one afternoon on a Saturday he asked his chauffeur to take him around to a few sites, and he went around a little bit and he said, "I'm going to put the airport where it is." And he came back, and that's where they put the airport. Well, they had a little trouble. 15 years later, they still couldn't decide where to put the supplementary airport. It was supposed to be an ancillary airport for National. There was Eisenhower was then president, and Eisenhower appointed a fellow named General Quesada, who was really a very nice fellow, who I got acquainted with a little bit, as I'm going to tell you. And General Quesada decided that they were going to have an airport at a place called Chantilly, which most people thought was Indian country. That, where is Chantilly? Somewhere west of here. So I had a client that had a quarry in the middle of what was to be Dulles Airport, And General Quesada's on the stand in 1958 down in Alexandria telling us why we needed 10,000 acres for Dulles Airport. Now, General Quesada was the fellow that flew Eisenhower over the Normandy beachheads on D-Day. He was a doer. He was commanding officer of the 9th Air Force in Europe. And he decided it's going to Chantilly. And I asked him why they needed 10,000 acres. They only had 1,000 at Hoover at National. They needed 4,000 at Burke. Why do you need 10,000? He said, well, there's a new airplane called a jet, and it's going to revolutionize air travel. And for that, you need a bigger airport and you need a sound barrier, and that's why we need 10,000 acres. And 4 years later, he opened Dulles Airport. I just got to tell you another footnote. When they wanted to build a 4th runway at Dulles, it took them 11 years to build the 4th runway, but it only took them 4 years to build the whole airport. And that's an indication of where we are in today's world of real estate and development and entrepreneurship. So there we were in the late 50s with Dulles Airport under construction, George Mason beginning to figure out where they ought to go from 8-room schoolhouse at Bailey's Crossroads to Fairfax. What was the Beltway going to amount to, and so on. And about that time along came a fellow named Jerry Halpin. And I think it's important to recognize some of the entrepreneurs that came along. Jerry just turned 90 last month. Jerry decided that the place to be was at Tysons Corner, which was then what was called a beer joint at the intersection of Route 7 and Route 123. That was the little beer joint. I condemned it when they widened Route 7, and the fellow said, gee, you only offered me $3,500 for my house, and I'm taking home $50,000 cash free from the guys going up Route 7 to Loudoun County, and you're only going to pay me $3,000. And I said, yeah, but we just can't take that into account because his parking lot was on the Route 7 right away. And that was Tysons Corner. About the same time, a fellow named Ted Lerner came along associated with Isidore Godowski, and they decided they might find a shopping center site in that area. Now, in those days, Tysons Corner was an old gravel pit. Back in World War II, I used to buy gravel there for 50 cents a ton FOB, and the gravel pit's where Tysons 2 is. Part of Tysons was still a dairy farm, and part of Tysons was just an abandoned land. So here we were in 1950 when I came to Fairfax with a really frontier area. It was my great privilege to be at the right place at the right time. And things in the 60s moved along pretty well. General Quesada finished his airport. We finished the Beltway, which was only 2 lanes in a lot of places because the Bureau of Public Roads said, what do you need more than 2 lanes each way for? Here you are out in the country with the Beltway. Why do you need that? We finally got 4 lanes for part of the way when they were only going to put 2. The practice of law in those days was about a dozen lawyers. You could have had the whole bar in this room and have ample room to spare. There were only a dozen or 2 lawyers in Fairfax City. People asked me, well, when did you specialize in land use law? I said, well, when I started practicing in '56, you did whatever came in the door. There wasn't any specialty. You were trying to make a rent pay, take care of the family, and it was whatever came in the door. Now, I wanted to set that stage because things moved rapidly in the 60 years since then. In the 60s, as things began to develop, the Beltway began to be used. Jerry started building in Tysons. Pimmet Hills was added to in various ways with single family by Steve Jonas. When he started building, he was proud. He sold 1,000 houses in 1960. He was proud to have done that. Ed Carr had started in Springfield, and that was beginning to sort of bloom on. And actually, Landmark Shopping Center was viewed, it opened in, I think, 59 or 60. Landmark Shopping Center in the along Shirley Highway in Alexandria was a big deal in those days. And what began to happen is that the citizenry that were moving in, the new folks, began to be unsettled and concerned about growth. And all of a sudden, growth became an issue. And there were a few things along the way that created problems. The county in the mid-50s tried to impose on the western third of the county a no-growth zone, and that went to litigation and was upset in the courts. That was along about 53 or 54 by the first lawyer in land use that I ever knew, a fellow named Lytton Gibson, who started thinking about growth and litigation. Well, this came to a head as we were trying to get Mason going. In 64, Jack Wood, the mayor of Fairfax, bought the first 150 acres that we have here in the Mason campus. And shortly after that, the 11 jurisdictions in Northern Virginia put $3.5 million together, and we bought an additional 200 acres, which is the campus you have today. And that, I represented the Board of Control of Mason, and we bought that land, and then Linwood Holton, the governor, appointed me to the first Board of Visitors of George Mason in '72. Now, all those things were happening, and in the election of '68, the board that took part in '68 was a little bit uncertain about the future. And by '71, as Bob said, there was a vicious anti-growth movement. And when I say vicious, I say that deliberately because it was a violent, vicious moment, take no prisoners, cut off everything. And the first thing that happened, they started something called the PLUS program. And the PLUS program was a nifty little synonym for no growth. It was pause for land use planning. And what that really meant is they wanted no growth. And in short order, in '72 and '73, they stopped processing plats, they stopped hearing zoning cases, and they started denying zoning on sewer. They then came along under the master plans and refused to plan under the master plans. Now, I want to quickly say also, the county in the '60s developed a very fine financial base under the direction of Carlton Massey. And Carlton Massey, who was the county executive, also had a very vigorous and aggressive planning department. The planning department planned not only recognized the two beltways in addition to the one that was built. There were 3 beltways planned in the region when they built the metro system in the 50s, when they planned that, but the locals in Fairfax County planned a half a dozen parkways, Monticello Parkway, Pimment Parkway, and some others. So the parkways were on the master plan, and the planners, who are sometimes criticized for not doing the right thing in the transportation infrastructure, were really the victims of the anti-growth movement. So when all this got going, I was trying to practice law. I was doing some land use work in between some other things while I was trying to make a living and support the family. And I realized that politically there was no way that the issue was going to be reversed, that the only recourse we had that would work would be litigation. And in between '72, actually starting in '71 on one master plan case, but from '72 to '76, I filed about a dozen suits. We forced the county to open up zoning. We forced the county to improve its sewer system. They thought that by denying permits because of overloaded sewer plants, they could prevent growth. There was a fellow named Norman Cole, who was a wonderful fellow, came to Fairfax working in the nuclear power business. He had been one of Admiral Rickover's nuclear submarine experts. He was a very aggressive fellow. He worked 24 hours a day. One day a phone rang at my house at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I said, "Norman, do you know what time it is?" He said, "No, why?" I said, "It's 4 o'clock in the morning. Why don't you go to bed?" But it didn't occur to Norman to stop, because during the day he worked in the office with his nuclear power issue, and during the nights he worked on pollution control in Virginia. And I started suing the county over denying permits, and the county said, well, we've got overloaded plants. And Noman's told me how to ask the right questions to put the right treatment in the plant so you could increase the capacity. And the county's people on the stand had to say, yeah, I guess we could do that. And the judge said, fine, you do that and issue permits in the meantime. And then we had the same issue with the land use. The county wanted a plus program, and I went to the county's attorney, and we had filed a series of lawsuits, and they wanted all these delays for zoning, and I went to the county attorney and said, how much time do you need for your planning? He said, oh, well, we need a year. Well, I knew it wasn't true in the first place. I knew a year wouldn't start the process. But I said, fine, we'll give you a year, and when the year is up, we want the zoning cases that are filed heard in the order of filing and no more deferrals. Well, 11 months later, the county attorney came to me and said, hey, by the way, we weren't able to get this done. You got to give us another year. And I said, no, you said a year, that's it. They went to court. Judge Sinclair looked down from the bench and said, Mr. Ruck, is this your signature? It says a year. And the judge said, so you're going to start hearing zoning cases. And they started hearing zoning cases. Actually, it was forced to do the zoning in 3 months. And I remember coming home a couple of times with the sun was coming up after they had heard zoning cases all night. Then they started demanding that you put 15% low moderate income housing in every project without any reference to what you were doing. Well, we were able to tell them, no, that was not the legal way to do it, and you couldn't do that. The one thing that I couldn't find a way to get litigated through the courts was transportation. That was a state function, still is a state function. But what happened is the antis so infiltrated the political system that they were able to deny transportation. The Board of Supervisors in 72 to 76 took all the master plan thoroughfares off the plans. And I was not able to figure any way that we could get that corrected. So by the end of 76, the board had met no success in its no growth efforts. And I was delighted and amazed that the citizenry began to realize the problem. And in 76, they elected a reasonably pro-growth board chaired by Jack Harity. And we started to turn things around. And that board put in place the Economic Development Authority that we now have today. That's the board that decided Fairfax was going to grow, and Fairfax was going to advertise for growth, and Fairfax was going to encourage growth. And that was the turning point in the whole 60 years that I've been around. Now, there are a few other things along the way. The proffer system. In the 80s, the county attorney came to me. I will say that in those days, Fairfax County had no acceptance in Richmond. They think today the political system up here is not welcome in Richmond. Well, in the 70s and 80s, it was completely unwelcome. And I had been summoned. Anybody that thinks there wasn't a bird organization, when I was a county judge, the senior circuit judge called me to his office one day and said, matter of fact, it was the year after I was out of the county court, and said, Til, young Harry needs a campaign manager in Fairfax County. That young Harry was Harry Bird, who died last couple of months ago at 98 years old, but his father was the Bird that created a lot of progress in the state of Virginia. Young Harry was running for his seat. He had a significant opponent from Alexandria, and the judge said, Til, you need to be his campaign manager. And I said, Judge, I don't know anything about politics. Judge said, don't worry about it, just hang a sign in the window, get a storefront, and you'll learn. And that was how I got into politics. Well, the reason I mention that is because my association with the Bird organization and the people in Richmond gave me a visa to Richmond. And when the proffer system was being promoted, which was to demand commitments at zoning in writing, I was able to go to Richmond and suggest that we needed the proper system. In fact, I wrote the statute. Now let me tell you what the proffer system did. In the days up till we had proffers in the early 80s, you come into a zoning, you made a commitment, the tree that's on the property will stay, or the land that we're going to leave for open space will be a park. And when the developer, who was my client, forgot about the tree and it was cut down, they used to blame the attorney, because there was no very effective way to demand or to implement a commitment like that. And that's how we got into the proffers, which said that if you make a commitment in writing, it can be part of the zoning. Prior to that time, we had cooked up all kinds of things like covenants that went with the land, and they were ineffective, so we organized a proffer system. Now, I want to footnote that. I knew when I wrote the statute, and I specifically provided there'd be no cash payment permitted or required, that would not last long. And sure enough, nowadays, the cash requirement is amazing. The statutes have been amended, cash is required, and zoning cases require a lot of cash payments. That came along with the political system. Now, and by the way, when I wind down and finish, I want anybody that's got a question or that I can clarify to be sure you ask questions. I think we're going to have time for that, and I would look forward to that. So by the 80s, Mason was beginning to move forward. Dulles Airport was open with no passengers, and we had to organize a group called the Dulles Task Force to begin to attract some of the airlines to Dulles Airport. The Beltway was thriving and had been added to at least 3 different times. Tysons Corner 1 was a thriving regional mall, and Ted Lerner was trying to figure out what to do with the 100 acres he'd bought, which is now Tysons 2, and some adjacent offices. A county and a region with great prosperity, with great promise for the future, and all it took were entrepreneurs to recognize it. Now let me fast forward a little while and talk about the current situation. I am concerned. I am very concerned about where the county and the region is. First thing is, the antis have continued to fight the transportation issues. We have no transportation plans that will really work. The American Legion Bridge is a disaster. It was built for 75,000 vehicles a day. It's now carrying 225,000, and it's expected to go to 300,000 in the next few years. There is no viable connection between Fairfax and Montgomery County, the 2 most prosperous counties in the region. And all this discussion about the future of Tysons, and I must say, I have a footnote about Tysons. Tysons is the most successful private enterprise project of its kind in the country. But the politicians couldn't avoid interfering with that. So the politicians a few years ago decided that they would make Tysons Corner pedestrian friendly, do away with automobiles, circuit the metro system that was supposed to go to Dulles through Tysons, build 4 stations with no parking, and call that progress at Tysons Corner. And I'm really concerned about the problem. With Tysons, the metro will not take the passengers. Even the best of the proponents of metro suggest that only 10% of the commuters are going to ride the metro. We'll have to see. And in the meantime, if the American Legion Bridge is not added to by putting new bridges upstream, Tysons Corner can't make it beyond where it is now, because you're not going to be able to help the traffic problem. Now we've got Reston out there by Dulles Airport, which is very interesting. Bob Simon, who's a very good guy and a good friend, started Reston, had the right vision, didn't have quite enough in the pocket to pull it off, but a few insurance companies later it worked, and Reston is now what it is. Dulles Airport is a huge success, almost. Dulles Airport lost 25% of its domestic travel last year, and the merger of American and U.S. Air is going to be a problem there because Dulles Airport built for 40 million passengers and they only got 22 or 3 million. And the future of Dulles is somewhat a concern. The metro system started, the train to Dulles, rail to Dulles was the slogan. Rail to Dulles started when the federal government was going to pay half of the $3 billion was estimated to cost. The rail to Dulles is now costing $7 billion. The federal payment is 15%. Fairfax County and Loudoun counties are each stuck with a $3 billion debt to pay for metro to Dulles. The ridership is now programmed, well, maybe in 10 years it will pay the operating expenses of metro. Now, I'm very concerned about the future at Tysons. I'm very concerned about the debt that's been taken on to build rail to Dulles. I'm very concerned about the $5.5 billion in debt that Dulles Airport now owes for all the expansion that was made at Dulles to anticipate 40+ million passengers a year. And I'm very concerned about the fact that the trajectory of growth in this region is not what it was for the past 60 years. The trajectory of growth has always been upward. In this region, contrary to any region in the rest of the country, there was always the anticipation that the future would be even more prosperous than the current. The federal government was pumping in uncounted billions into the economy of Northern Virginia. That is not going to continue. The federal government is not going to be the milk cow that it has been for the past 60 years. There is a future ahead which I don't think has been very well recognized. Steve Fuller, who is an associate of Bob's, has suggested that the growth is going to be here, some of it, but it's going to require much different education. It's going to be a much lesser prosperous growth. It's not going to have the flush future that it has had. And I'm concerned about that. Now, when you boil all this down, in the 60 years almost that I've been here, there have been two things that have seemed to me to be vital. The anti-growth issue was a major commitment, a major accomplishment which had tremendous effect on the whole region. But the two things that have concerned me the most have been education and transportation. That's why I've been involved in Mason. That's why, actually, Bob didn't mention it, but I'm pleased to say I've been involved quite seriously at Harvard College and Harvard Law School in education. And in transportation, we founded 25 years ago the Northern Virginia Transportation Allowance, which is operated by a fellow named Bob Chase, and he has been working on transportation for all these 25, now 26 years. And he has carried the torch for the transportation that we need. The transportation that we need has been vigorously opposed by things like the PEC, which are my neighbors in Fauquier County, the Sierra Club, the Smart Growthers, and a host of others that think that building roads is the wrong way to do it. You simply have got to build the roads. When they planned the transportation system with Metro, Metro was to be the radial system, and Metro was to serve the city of Washington. Very few people realize that the Metro system was not built to serve the suburbs. It was built to serve the District of Columbia, which it serves very well. The suburbs were going to be served by the three beltways that would connect to the Metro system as you went out in the radio around Washington, and that was to be the transportation system in the suburbs. That system was never happened. The current beltway is a disaster. The local jurisdictions are unwilling politically to take on what we need to do to build even what's now called the North-South corridor in place of the Western corridor, which should be the second beltway. The third beltway, nobody even wants to talk about. But here we are with Steve Fuller saying we're going to expand by a couple million people in the next 20 years. How are they going to get from A to B? The road system is totally inadequate today. The political world is unable to deal with it. And the antis have never let up. The smart growthers, the Sierra Club, the PEC is not willing to allow any of this to happen. So here we are in 2014 with a lot of expectant people that are real estate entrepreneurs now and in the future. I admire you for your interest. I encourage the interest in real estate, and I encourage the interest in enterprise. But in order to do that, you've got to be part of the solution. You cannot expect it to continue as it has. I was fortunate. There were a few people when I was coming along, like Jerry Halpin and Ted Lerner and Earl Williams, who started the Economic Development Authority and really put it on the track. There was Bill Wrench, who saw to build in the Fairfax Parkway. And let me just outline a couple of specific instances. When we were trying to build the Fairfax County Parkway, Milt and I built the first interchange and the part of it from 66 to 50. We were trying to get the rest of it built, and Jack Harity had Governor Dalton fire Bill Wrench from the Highway Commission because he supported the Fairfax County Parkway. Fortunately, Bill had gotten to the place where the meeting after he resigned, Harity cooked up a deal which he later admitted was pure phony to say there was a conflict with Bill, and a cub reporter for the Washington Post named Fred Hyatt put it on the front page, and John Dalton chickened and said, you got to get Bill to resign. And he did. And that was the first very visible experience I saw with politicians who refused to do what needed to be done. Then we started talking about the bridge, and Frank Wolf, who's a good friend and always has been, got a $2 million appropriation from the feds to study the bridge upriver from the American Legion Bridge. When some of the constituents in Loudoun County started fussing about it, Frank panicked, pulled the $2 million and terminated the study. And nowadays the feds refuse to get involved because Frank Wolf wouldn't let them do it. Now, just so my comments are bipartisan, Mark Warner walked in my office one day and said, Till, I need a heavy contribution. I want you and your wife to have a party for me, and I'm going to be sure that the Techway Bridge is built in my term as governor. And by the way, we'll get the right-of-way for the Western Corridor. And we said, fine. Mike Herculation, who some of you may have heard of, who was a big developer down in the Alexandria area. Mike and I sat there, made a very serious contribution. I choke when I think about how big it was. And we had a party for 400 people at the house and invited a lot of people, and that sort of launched Mark Warner's career. I never heard the word Techway or the mentioned after he got elected, and he sent his Secretary of Transportation around to tell me they didn't have $9 million to finish the EIS study on the Western Corridor. So there you have a bipartisan view of the antis and how they are able to prevent our highway system from happening. Now, I really would like to charge each of you with taking a major role in our future, current and future, because the business community basically for 60 years has been AWOL where it really counted. The business community is generally organized, whether it's chambers, frankly the Board of Trade, Federal City Council, they're organized as membership organizations. They'll do anything to have members. They'll have meetings and be enthused about things, but do they ever accomplish much? Not in my opinion. It is time that the business organizations became a factor in our community and not just signs on the wall and notes in the telephone book and conversations about how great they are. It's up to the business community to produce. If you don't produce, you're not going to have the opportunities that you should have, that you could have. You're going to have to take an active role individually as participants in the business community and in the affairs of the country, of the area. There's a current move afoot by a fellow named Bob Buchanan called the 2030 Group. He is working with Steve Fuller in housing, education, and transportation to see if we can't get action from the entities, from the business community that should be acting. Now, my final sort of comment is, what does it take to fill out real estate entrepreneurship? It's very simple in my view. It takes vision, it takes courage, and it takes determination. You've got to have the vision to do the right thing, whether it's for your own project or whether it's for the community, whether it's building. Milt Peters and I made available about 20,000 lots in Fairfax County, because starting in 1970, we realized that there was a shortage of housing in the county. We went down and bought the residue of the Burke Airport land, and that became Burke Center. And we kept going from there, total about 20,000 lots. We put Fair Lakes together up on 66 because there was a lot of vacant land up there, and it seemed like it was a good place for some commercial. That's vision. Now, courage, I don't need to explain what courage is. I just need to emphasize it. You've got to have the courage the conviction is the word. If you have the vision, know that you're going to have a tough time with it and undertake it and win. And that means you've got to have the determination to stay with it. You can't be on and off. You've got to cut out your deal. You've got to stay with it. And you've got to also do it part for your own business and part for the community. George Mason wouldn't be what it is today if the people whose pictures you see around the wall hadn't been involved in making George Mason what it is. It didn't happen. There's nothing in the Bible and there's nothing in the Constitution that says George Mason will be successful. It's successful because a few people decided that it ought to happen. A few people that started Bailey's Crossroads, Mason in an 8-room schoolhouse at Bailey's Crossroads, Jack Wood, the mayor of Fairfax, when the time came, where are we going to put the campus when we move it out of Arlington? People talked about Reston, people talked about Wakefield. Jack Wood says, I'm not going to talk, I'm going to give you 150 acres right here adjacent to Fairfax City. And that's how it started. Now it takes that kind of vision, that kind of commitment, and that action. I can't emphasize too much the fact that conversation is cheap, but it doesn't accomplish much. You've got to have the courage and the determination to do what is necessary to make the vision come true. And that doesn't often mean that you're going to be popular. You know, when I've heard slogans, don't till Loudoun County, and a lot of other things. Over the years, I've heard a lot of people think that till was evil. My son bought a piece of land down in Charlottesville, and believe it or not, the PEC started saying, the Hazels have come to Greene County. You got to watch out what they're going to do in Greene County. So you got to ignore all that. You got to do what is right. You got to do what is necessary to implement your vision, and you got to have the determination to stay with it. It's been a great pleasure to come visit. I hope I've left some thoughts that may be of interest.